Hello, David R. Becker here with Becker Art, and today I want to talk to you about these new Holbein granulating pigments. And these pigments are going to help you and teach you how to do watercolor. Isn't that strange that I'm saying that? But it's true because this pigment granulates and has like three pigments in there that are really beautiful colors. And when you float them wet into wet on a surface, they give you these beautiful looks, as you can see right here. They give you these beautiful washes of watercolor that kind of separate and they float, and pigment kind of comes out of one area, and then you'll get like two different colors in this thing. And so it's really interesting kind of paint that you wouldn't normally get if you're just using one color. And many of the students who start out with watercolor, they basically don't mix many colors together, or if they do, they over mix them. And so these paints, I think, will really help you in learning how to work with in watercolor. It's really cool. So what you can do is when you're applying your paint, I always tell my beginner students is that when you apply your paint, you put down water, or you put water in your brush with pigment and then put it down, and you're either going to get a hard edge or a soft edge. And so if you're getting a soft edge, it's wet in the wet, right? Because you're doing wet and wet. Wet on dry gives you a hard edge, but inside your hard edge will always be wet in the wet too. So saying that, when you're using this paint, if you don't put it down correctly, if you just don't have enough water, it will not do its thing. It will not separate and granulate like it's supposed to. And so it's like a paint that will help you learn how to do watercolors, which I just thought about because I did a bunch of paintings this last week in with only this paint. And I really saw that if you don't do it right, then you're making not enough water or too much water. Well, that's not too big a deal. That everybody knows when you have too much water, it just you can't get any control of your pigment. But with this, if you're using the correct amount of water or applying it wet into wet, you're going to get this beautiful granulation happening with this paint. So let me just show you. I just want to, here I have all 24 colors out here. These are all 24 colors that Holbein just put out. And so let's say we're doing a wet into wet wash. And so we're just going to put down water. And this had dried overnight now. And so nice thing is they still act like Holbein watercolors, where you can rejuvenate them instantly with just a little bit of water. So I'll take a color. I'll take this color right here, and I'll drop it into water. See, I just put a little bit of water down there. But you see how it's spreading out, and it'll granulate and give me two different colors. It'll give me the granulation. There's some purple in here, and there's some blue in here, and it will identify as a granulating pigment. So if I were just to use a regular color, let me just actually do that. Let me just use a regular color, the same type of color, and I'll re-wet this with just normal. I have a little bit of my brush still, but let's say you just go in with one color like by itself. This is horizon blue, and unfortunately there was a little bit of paint in there. But see, this is horizon blue by itself, and again, floating your pigment, meaning water is down and you put it down, and now this is on a hard edge because I did not wet all around here, but inside this square is wet into wet. But see how this now is separating different colors. There's a lighter blue and a darker blue with purple in there, and you can only get that if you have enough water like this and you float your pigment in there. And if I took that same color and made it too thick, let's say I went in here, made it too thick, you are not going to get that floatiness happening. Well, if it's really thick, it still works here with a little bit of color. But if I'm using it thick, like wash, you're not going to get quite that look of this thing separating. So when you're doing a wash, and this is a hard edge, this is a soft edge because wet in the wet, this is wet on dry. And so when I'm doing that, I will not get this look. I will not get that effect of it separating. And even here, look at, none of this is separating. And here, I know I didn't make a rectangular shape to it, but it was still wet inside. And this was all wet inside, but that's just one color, right? It's just one color. It's not anything separating. This one was the granulating color. And you're seeing a little bit of the granules, and you are seeing them separate. And so this, I think to myself, is when students are using their watercolor and they're putting down enough water, it's going to teach them that you need to do wet and a wet. Because even when you're doing a hard edge, let me just show you. Even if you're doing a hard edge, I'm going to take a little bit of this color to start out with. If I take a little bit of this color to start out with, and then I make an angle, make a hard edge, right? And make a hard edge square. And then I put this color into this thing. Watch how it'll separate, even with it being in this square. I'm going to drop some of this pigment in there. In a square hard edge, and it'll be different from this because this is all going to be evenly one color. This will, when I do wet into wet, put some water in there, put this wet into wet to the hard edge, and it will granulate. It will granulate, and it will do this thing where it separates, and separates maybe the darker blue from the light blue. So you put water in there with a hard edge. So watercolor, when you put down watercolor into a surface, you do it always wet. Unless you're doing like a tint, this is going to separate. You're going to see things are going to separate here a little bit. Because one of the pigments is a little bit heavier and one's a little bit thicker, or it's just a different weight of the pigment. And meaning that it's either smaller or bigger. And so then you're going to see it separating within water. This one was just horizon blue with no other pigment, just that's the one pigment, and you can see it's nice and smooth because it was wet in the wet. But this will be wet in the wet, like this was wet in the wet, and here it really separated. See the purple? There's purple in there, and there's a light blue in there. This one was just the one. This is it using it too thick. This is where I didn't put much water in there, and I used it thick, but still it was thin, and it was still thick. It was still wet enough to make it smooth, but it's not separating because there's not enough water for it to float into. So it'll give the beginner an idea of like when you're putting pigment onto the surface, you need to have water. And unless you want a texture on dry paper, let's say I'll take a big scoop of this and I'll put a lot of pigment in here with a lot of water in my brush, and I'll take it across a sheet of paper quickly. And then you're going to get texture, right? Because that's taking it across it quickly with the same pigment. But this part right here has a little bit more water in it, right? This part is just little particles of water that hit the surface of the paper, giving you texture. But again, the difference is to teach you how to do the wet into wet is that there has to be water to float your pigment on. That's my big thing, is always saying float your pigment, meaning take that pigment, float it into water. And the thicker the pigment, the more you can control it in the water. And this really helps this pigment because you can see right away, if you did it right, you get the separation of the pigment. If there's enough water to separate it. If it's too thick like this, it will not separate. It'll just stay even and thick. That's like makes it so the darker that color is, the darker if I use that color, it would, let's just take a really thick amount. And this is like gouache. See, I just made it so thick. Then you'll get more one color because it has no chance to granulate and float on top of the surface with water. So this will be great. I think this pigment is going to be great for the student because it'll just, when you're practicing like this, taking a sheet of paper and learning how to use the pigment, which every beginner student should do. They should just take a sheet of paper. Don't do a painting. Just learn how to make soft and hard edges and float your pigment. This paint will help you out so much because you'll see if you do it right. If you floated your pigment right, you get the separation happening like this purple and blue. Let's try another one. Let's try, I mean, some of these colors are just amazing how they separate. No, that's a purple. Let's try a, let me think. Let's try this one here. This is a really nice color. And so if I put it down with no water first, let's say I just put it down with a lot of pigment or water in my brush. So right now I have a lot of water in my brush, but I also have a lot of pigment in my brush. And this is again dried from last night, but look at how just a little bit of water will rejuvenate it instantly. And so I'm putting this in there, and I'm going to add water to it to make like a gradation. And as I bring it down, it's going to be wet, but the hard edges, look at how the hard edges are hard because of the dry paper. But when I bring this down and just add water, it's going to let the pigment float. This pigment's floating, this pigment, and when you can tell when something's floating is that it's softening itself. It's smoothing itself out when you have a lot of water. and then you put a lot of pigment in, it's smoothing itself out. Now, if you have too much pigment in that water, then it's just going to sit on top, right? It's not going to expand and drip around from there. So not too much pigment, and if you just do a little bit of pigment, or yeah, a little bit of pigment with a lot of water. So this is a lot of water with just slightly amount of pigment. It'll be a lighter color of this, right? But it will still separate. And this is, I call it more of a tint, where you just use a little bit of pigment. But I think this will even granulate, though. Even if I have this small amount of pigment, it will still separate because there's two separate types of pigment in there. And look at this, how it just, right there, it's separating within this wash. But as I go down here, look at this, the blue, and there's a little bit of a blue that's coming out of here. It's just some amazing paint that is, it's pretty amazing. Like this one right here is a tint of it. But you can see they're separating, the particles are separating the pigment. I call pigment particles or pigment. And so here it's going real light. It's going real light, but you can see right here, this makes it smooth out all by itself, and you're seeing granulation in the pigment. It's like pigmented, and there's this blue in there, and there's like a terracotta type of color in there. This almost looks like three colors in this one. You can see the blue, right? You can see the blue in there, and it's like a blue and a brown, or like a alizarin almost. So, or a purple and blue and brown. But it's amazing how, if you do it right, if you float your pigment, and even as a tint, it will show. But if you don't let your pigment float, and you're just not using enough water, then it'll be this, where you don't get anything happening. It's just one big wash. And that means you're also using too much paint and not enough water when you're not floating your pigment. Hard edge, excuse me. And so if I put a second wash over this, I have to wait till it dries, and I can still get the granulation on top of that. But if you start getting too many colors on top of a color on top of a color, then it'll start getting gray and brown. But I really thought it was important that you can even just get one color of this paint medium. I think you can't buy just one color right at the moment because it just came out, but you can buy a box of 6 of this and a box of 24. The boxes of 6 are all like a winter, wind, which is landscape. There's a couple of, there's 4 different or 5 different boxes that have the 6 colors on there, or 4 different boxes. But look at that granulation happening in there. I don't know if you can see that, but it's just simply amazing how they granulate. And to apply them correctly, this will not happen if you do not use enough water. As you can see here, it's happening a little bit, but that's not enough paint in there to do it with, right? So if you want a certain color, and you want it like the color that it is in the tube where you're using it, you have to put enough water so it floats on the surface. And if you wanted to have soft edges like this and separate within a lot of water, you just got to remember to use enough paint. And this will teach students how to use enough paint. To get that look, you need enough granular pigment to make it do that. If you just do like a tint like this, it's not going to look as good, and it's not going to get you that look of granulation. This is just a tint, and so and most students do this. They don't use enough pigment, and they always feel like they need to get the color, like when they get the light colors, but when they go in for a color that's too dark and they use it too thick, and they want it light because they want the white of the pigment, well, then it means you have to use more water and let the white of the paper shine through. Well, look at this one. See here, even with the hard edge, this one is purple and blue in there, and it's granular, and you can see it's separating because you have enough water. And this one again is not enough water. Let's try another one more time. Let's see. I'm going to take and try to make it too much water. Now I've not tried 2 of these together yet, but I'm thinking that'd be another thing that you can granulate too. So if you take, let's say, this green, and if you put it too thick without letting it float, but this is floating, so it'll do something. Then if, let's say, I took another color on top of that, that's also one of these granulating colors. Let's take this really bright orangey pink. And see, my pigment's floating. If I put 2 pigments together and they're both wet, I don't have to rub that to soften that edge. I just let the wetness pull that thing through. And so this will granulate, but not probably as much as if I had a little bit more water, a little bit more pigment, because the more water, it's going to float more. And this is not floating too much. This is just barely floating. Like I'm just putting it down and see the lines of my brush. I can see the lines of my brush right here because it's not just quite enough water to make it soften itself completely like these things are. See, if I put more water in there, but that means I would have to put more pigment in there too. It's all about learning for beginners how to use pigment, and this I thought myself was a really good way to show you, the beginner, if you can make it, put down the water the right way, put down the pigment the right way. Because it's all about using more pigment and fresh pigment. Most students don't use fresh pigment. They use dried up pigment that they're just getting a little bit of pigment out. You really have to know how much pigment you have on your brush and fresh pigment. And the nice thing about Holbein is that all their watercolors stay fresh. They don't dry to a hard rock. Like this one doesn't either. I mean, these are dried for 2 days now, and they're still soft, but they will dry to a rubbery substance. But as soon as you apply a little bit of water to them, they rejuvenate instantly. So I'm going to take a little bit of this pink right here. Watch this. It's all about how to use the pigment. And this, I think, will let the beginner really learn how to use pigment and how to do a wash wet in the wet. Because if you don't do it right and make it too thick or it's not floating, then you will not get this beautiful granulation happening. All right. So there you go. Get yourself maybe a small set of 6 to start out with, and try them. They're beautiful colors. They stay nice and pliable instantly. They rejuvenate instantly. And look at the washes they make. And now this is almost dry, but look at, there's purple and red and orange all in there. It's just, to me, it's fascinating how this happens, and it just by floating the pigment into the water and just letting it float. This one was the light blue and a purple and a dark blue. So this one looks like it has maybe 2 or 3 colors in there. I think 2. But yeah, so it must have 2 because there's purple and light blue, and this is the same one. This one was wet in the wet, soft edges. This is red on dry with a hard edge. All right. So thanks again, guys, for watching my videos. And please subscribe to my channel if you do like all these things, and have them notify you too. Put on your notification, and then every time I have a new video out, it'll email you and let you know that I have new videos out there, or when I'm out live and I didn't pre-record it and I just all of a sudden decided to go live. But so sign up and subscribe to my channel, and we'll see you on Thursday when we'll be doing some flowers. This week in my newsletter, we're working a little bit about flowers and how to paint flowers, and I'll be possibly using some more of this paint too, because I'm really starting to like this paint a lot. So get yourself some Holbein Granulating Watercolors, and I'll see you on Thursday. Thanks a lot, guys. Bye-bye.